Hi everyone, my name is Nora Lenz and I'm here having a conversation today with Robert Rust. Robert has been studying truthful, objective, factual information for decades now, and he's made some very important discoveries. And the basic premise of our conversation today is going to be around the idea that everybody, regardless of their other affiliations or beliefs or belief systems, knows that there's something wrong with modern civilization. It's not working. It's never really worked very well, and it's not sustainable, and it's going to cause the ultimate demise of humanity. But people don't really know the particulars about why that situation exists, and that's what Robert has looked into, and that's what I wanted to talk about today. So we'll just start with the idea that Robert has discovered that geography plays a very important role in humanity's efforts to be sustainable and be civilized. And this geological information is very important for us to pass along. So we're going to start with a little short lesson in what Robert has learned from his study of geography, which might be surprising to a lot of people because people are thinking that the really important information might lie elsewhere, but geography is actually central. So I'll just cut Robert loose on that idea.
All right. Yeah, when we look into the history of Earth, humanity, life, and so forth, we tend to get to a point and then stop instead of getting to continuing to find an ultimate connection between everything. For example, we might look into medicine and see how corrupted it is with regard to its disease philosophy. Or we might look into raw food, our natural diet, or we might look into government or a variety of other subjects. And when we get to the end of that subject, then we were satisfied for that particular subject, but then we end. Instead of trying to connect it all together, and fundamentally, we know everything has to be connected. We only have one existence.
Hey, Robert, you're fading out in and out a little bit. Can you move your mic up closer?
Okay, how's that?
That's much
All
better.
right.
Thank you. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so that's what I've done. I've looked at each area and then I've tried to see how they're all connected, how they came together, influencing each other. For example, you might look at religion and say, okay, I understand what that's about, but how did it come to be? Why is it there? Did we used to have it? And so forth. So you ask these questions. Now, when one investigates long enough and deep enough, then one realizes that there is a connection. And with regards to humanity and the current life on Earth, the forms of life, evolution, and the geography of Earth, geology of Earth, you come to realize that it's the geology of Earth, the behavior of Earth itself, that has dictated the development of life and geological form on Earth, and that has led to everything that we see today, including humanity, civilized humanity, and our current modern civilization.
And why is that? Why does geology play such a central role in that?
Well, geology, which will be the way the Earth behaves, determines or regulates the life on the planet. Our life organisms have to live within that geology, and the geology is the environment, and the environment provides the opportunity for the life to grow, and the life must be able to live within each different type of geology or environment. So that geology is directly dictating what the life is going to grow into or what it can become. And so it is with us. We are completely regulated. Our development has been determined by the geology of Earth.
What
so
specific,
for us,
what specific, I think we need to zero in on the specific aspect of geology that is most important to us right now at this point in history with our species.
Yes, okay. So when we investigate the geology of Earth, we come to understand that there are 4 basic motions of Earth that shape life on Earth. There's the rotation, daily rotation, we get day and night. And then we have the orbit of the Earth around the sun, which gives us heat and light. And then we have the tilt of the Earth, or the wobble of the Earth. And this gives us the seasons, because that wobble is what we call the tilt. So we have changing seasons as we go north. And then we have the 4th motion. And with regard to life, this is the most important one, because it is the one that threatens it, can threaten it, and does threaten it, and pushes it into evolving, changing, adapting. And that is crustal displacement. The Earth has a irregular periodic crustal displacement behavior, and this occurs every 20,000 years or so. And
that's been happening on Earth for billions of years.
That's right. It's been going on.
The crust of the Earth moves around, and it does this on a cyclical basis.
That's right. The crust of the Earth builds imbalances slowly over thousands of years, and they build up to a certain point, which causes the crust to seek equilibrium again, a new balance. And so the crust over a few thousand years will slowly rotate to a new position, while the interior of the Earth, the bulk of the Earth, remains stable, doesn't change its tilt or its rotation. The crust keeps rotating with it, but it also develops another rotation, a displacement that rebalances the crust to put it in a dynamically stable position.
And Robert, isn't it true that we can see that there's evidence of the continents having been formed out of the same, they have the same shapes, like Africa looked like it could fit into South America. Is there any validity to that? Were they once connected and they drifted apart? Is that crustal displacement?
Yeah, that's crustal displacement. It's an effect of it. When the crust displaces, it has to continue fitting over the surface of Earth. The Earth is an oblate sphere. It has a greater diameter at the equator than through the poles. So if this thin crust of the Earth, which is a spherical shell, moves over the bulk of the Earth, as it moves towards the equator, it has to rip open in equatorial zones, or the closer it is to the equator, in order to be able to still continue fitting. And so it does do that. That results in the crust itself splitting apart and creating larger distances between the continents, which we then see as the rift zone in the middle of the Atlantic between North America and South America and Africa and Europe. So over multiple displacements, hundreds of them, these rippings of the crust as for each displacement that occurs causes these continents to move farther and farther apart. And so we see their coastlines matching. Okay.
So before we get too much into the mechanics of crustal displacement, let's talk a little bit about the cycle of it, how we know that it's relatively predictable, how long the displacement actually lasts. So it comes every 20,000 years and it lasts thousands of years. And we happen to be right now at the end of one of those peaceful periods, one of those periods when the crust is not moving at all, hardly at all. Right. And we're at the very end of that. So we're fixing to go into displacement. And that's why this is this information is so important. But let's talk about the cycle of it and how it can be predicted and known, and how it has been known by previous cultures.
Right. Well, in establishing that crustal displacement is occurring regular in the past, one can study the work of Charles Hapgood. He reveals a lot of the geological science that basically proves that it is occurring. He also describes the environment that geology and other science exist within, the political environment that prevents us from being able to see that clearly. So once we study that geology and realize it's occurring, we can also use more modern discoveries that have been produced in the last 20 years. Charles Hapgood, he up until like 1980 or something like that, and so he didn't have available to him all the geological knowledge we have today. To establish when these displacements are occurring, their regularity, one looks at the Antarctic ice core record, another ice core record, and ocean level data.
Did he have those? Did Hapgood have those?
No.
No, okay.
Those are recent, in the last 20, 30 years.
Okay. He was still able to establish this, though, definitively.
Yes, he was able to establish through geological evidence, fossil evidence, glaciation, volcanism, and similar, that there had been multiple displacements in the last 100,000 years. Mm-hmm. It's difficult to see the effects of a particular individual displacement the farther you go back, because as time goes, erosion erases everything and covers the tracks, you could say, of mm-hmm. a displacement that occurred, say, 300,000 years ago. Right. But you certainly can tell when the last displacement occurred, and the one before that, and the one before that, by just looking at straightforward geological evidence that was available to Hapgood.
And now we have more.
We have more. And specifically it's the ice core data. And knowing that crustal displacement is occurring, one can look at that data correctly.
But that doesn't get done in mainstream
That isn't being
science.
Done today. Right. That isn't being done today because geology is politically stuck in uniformitarianism and a pressure to not accept that the Earth is undergoing crustal displacement. It's uniformitarianism. Just says that the Earth slowly changes, but overall remains the same.
Right.
There's no sudden events happening, such as a crust displacement, where change greatly increases.
But the evidence shows otherwise.
Despite evidence showing that in our past, there have been times when great change, up to 100 times the rate of what we experience today, occurs. We have devastation amongst animals and landscapes and much more. And Hapgood pointed a lot of this out, and many others, loads of scientists have done this as well. So the evidence is screaming at us that there are periods of time in which great geological change occur, which also then brings great changes in life on the planet, which affects evolution.
Right.
So anyway, so with regard to the frequency of these events, one can look at the data from the ice cores and the ocean levels to determine when these crustal displacements have occurred in the past and how frequently. And so we look at the actual graph form from the data from the ice in Antarctica and the ocean level, and they all show a repeating pattern. Ocean level rising and falling, or content of the atmospheric CO2 and temperature where the ice cores are taken, and then also CH4 in the atmosphere and dust in the atmosphere, or ocean precipitate dust. And these all show an identical repeating pattern. In other words, something is driving them. Something underneath, very large, that covers the whole Earth, is driving these changes. And that, of course, is crust displacement, because that involves the full movement of the entire crust of the Earth, bringing all the dramatic events, such as volcanism.
Apart from the data that you have from these studies, the climate data and all of that, ocean data, what other evidence do you have that supports the idea that this cyclical event has happened throughout Earth's history and that humanity has managed to survive it, even though it's extremely calamitous to the surface of the Earth? Like I'm thinking of, cultural evidence, civilizational evidence, civilizations that existed before ours that function differently than we do in our
right.
way.
Well, before I answer that, I'll just state from the ice core records and ocean levels, we can see that the crustal displacements are occurring on an average of about every 20,000 years over the last million years, and that they go on for hundreds of millions of years before that. The crustal displacement itself will last, it's difficult to say exactly, but around, say, 2,000 years, and then there's maybe 18,000 years of a calm period. The displacements may last up to 4,000 years, but most of the period during each 20,000 year span will be calm, other than after effects of the actual displacement itself. The displacement itself brings the greatest rate of change. So it's every 20,000 years, lasting, I say, a couple thousand years.
Okay, yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't let you get to that part. But so now we're living at the very end of one of these 20,000 year periods.
And yes, the ice core evidence and ocean level evidence clearly shows that we're at the very end of one of the calm periods. We're right at the point at which a crustal displacement will begin. The last one occurred 20,000 years ago, and the graph shape shows that we're right at the precipitous. We're at that period. We're at the same height, and then the graphs drop off, showing that a great change started, and that change is occurring because of a crustal displacement, as it has in the past.
So we're at the peak. And how long does that peak usually last? I mean, 50 years?
Yeah.
100 years?
Well, the peak, for example, if you measure the ocean level, it shows it rising for, say, 15,000 years steeply at the point at which we were over the last 20,000 years. And then it slows down rising. And that slowing down is a few, maybe 5,000, 6,000, something like that, years. And that at that point, it suddenly starts dropping. And we're right at that point where we've had this 6,000, 7,000 year period of slowing down of the ocean level rising and other changes such as CO2 in the atmosphere and CH4 and so forth, slowing down their chains. And from the previous cycles, we can see at that point, when you get the slowdown, there's a sudden drop, and that's dramatic. The graph is virtually vertical, and that's showing that right at that point, just prior to it, a crustal displacement occurred, which then forced dramatic change to start happening on Earth. Our current graph is at that point, our current time.
And we have at least 4 of those that we can see from the past.
Yeah, we have at least 4. We have actually about 70 or more.
Really? Okay.
Yeah, you can go back a million years. In 100,000 years, you'll have 4 or 5 of them. So if you go back a million, that's 50 alone right there.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And when we go to longer term graphs that show the changes going back 10 million years and 100 million years, we see the same pattern. It just keeps repeating this sharp up and down of the ocean levels.
And there's absolutely no way that that can be accounted for in modern geology that says we're just undergoing this slow, steady change on Earth.
No, looking at the graphs, one immediately can see with the rising, falling ocean level that there's a great change occurring here. The ocean level is going from a minimum to a maximum level, and the difference between the two is about 430 to 450 feet. And it's doing that every 100,000 years. It's going from a minimum to a maximum over about 100,000 year period, and then repeating that. It goes from a minimum to a maximum level, the ocean. It takes about 100,000 years. In the last 200,000 years, it's taken 120,000 years to do that. But it hits its maximum over that 100,000 year period, and then it suddenly drops.
What's the relationship of that to this 20,000 year cycle of crustal displacement?
Well, in the 100,000 year period, we have 5 crustal displacements. That can be established from partly from Hapgood's work, which showed that there's been 3 or 4 displacements in the last 100,000 years, that they're regularly occurring on every 20 to 30,000 years, and plus evaluation of the behavior, the dynamical behavior can establish that there has to be 5 displacements occurring. All right, now that's physics, rotational dynamic physics, and I won't get quite into that because it's a little more complicated. Simple, but still complicated. Now, so we get 5 displacements within a 100,000 year span, and then that repeats itself going back into time for millions and millions of years. All right, so during these 5 displacements, the ocean level is going from a minimum to a maximum. It's just each displacement is causing a bit of change, but it's always an increase or a decrease. Okay. Depending which direction you're going, looking at the graph. So the ocean level will go from a minimum and then increase to a max. And at the maximum, it'll suddenly drop off and then increase down to its minimum again over the 100,000 years, and then we get a rise again. I'm not explaining that exactly the best. But.
And we have 1 million years worth of evidence to show that.
Oh yeah, we have records, geological records through the ice and ocean levels that go back 1 million years, and that's solid. And then we have even more records of similar data that goes back millions of years, beyond like 100 million years and so forth.
Okay. Now, what about, can we get into a discussion of the other evidence that humanity has known about this since the beginning, and it has found ways to survive it?
Right. This is where we make connections. Crustal displacement is occurring, and of course it's going to have effects on everything because it's worldwide, covers the entire Earth. And so when we look into other fields, we expect to be able to see effects of it. And certainly we will see that with humanity, because we've been living through this, and it's a life-regulating event. It shapes the surface of the Earth, which then the species that live on that surface must adapt to. The displacements are causing the crust to shift 3,000 miles each time on average. And so that's putting species into different environments, different climate zones. The climate zones in the atmosphere remain the same because the Earth's tilt is not changing. Its orbit around the sun isn't changing. Just the crust itself is rotating. And so that puts species on the planet into totally new environments, and those species must then adapt to those environments. And if they're not able to, then they go extinct. All right. So they have time to do this over thousands of years. And if they're successful, then they remain as a species, although they'll be changing somewhat because they're having to eat new vegetation. They're in a new temperature environment and so forth. So we get this change in the species, which is called evolution, speciation. So anyways, so we look at humanity, and in its history, we can see its behavior, how it behaved, what it did that is much different than how we live today as modern civilization. We can look into the past of the humanity and through archaeology see that they built much different structures than we do today. They were focused on rock construction for all their buildings. Their society, their culture was built around using megaliths, which is large stones for creating buildings, monuments, and so forth.
And they didn't do that because they were stupid, because they didn't have our technology, that they didn't know how to build glass buildings. They didn't do that. They did that for a reason. They did that because that was sustainable and stable, right?
Yeah, they did that because they evolved to do it because of crustal displacement. When crustal displacements happened, they increased earthquakes and tsunamis and volcanism by 10,000 to 100,000 times over this 2,000 or so year period. And so if you're a civilization, you're a humanity, you got to learn how to live with that for 2,000, 3,000 or so years of massive earthquakes and volcanism going on.
Or you have to adapt to the new environment that you're put into. Yeah. And we didn't do that, clearly, because we are still intactly tropical species. We have no hair over our bodies. We still, everything is intact from when we lived in the tropics.
Yeah, right. So when these displacements occur, we're being moved from our birth home outside, which is the tropics, outside the tropics. And since these displacements are always occurring, we're never able to move back in the tropics. And so what the human did, we adapted to these new environments we were putting in by using our brain to study nature around us to determine ways that we could live, still continue to live. So we studied nature, which is science, and then we developed means by which to live from the knowledge that we gain. That's technology.
And that early development of ours accounts for our big brain, right? I mean, archaeology, and I don't know what ology it is that tries to account for the way we are. But it says something like our brains got big when we started hunting because we had to figure out how to get prey. And, they make up stories about why our brains are so big, but this makes perfect sense. We had to have big brains. We had to be smart to stay ahead of crustal displacement, right? We had to figure out a way to survive without adapting to our environment. Is that right?
Yeah, it's something like that. All kinds of different species are slowly developing, and they have different size of brains and different physical abilities. And the human is an ape, and it developed through all the changes that occurred, a larger brain. And by its diet, which is a fruit diet, it allowed itself to spend a lot of its energy on mental activities or social activities instead of just looking for food only, such as a predator has to do when it's looking for game to eat, which is difficult to digest and takes a lot of its energy and time to search out all these prey.
And our food is practically everywhere. It's just hanging everywhere.
Right, and so we developed in the tropics to eating fruit, and fruit provides a lot of energy for low input energy. We don't have to search for it much. When we do eat it, it's pre-digested. We get a lot of energy out of it. We don't expend energy much on it. And this gives us lots of free time to do other things. And so we evolved that way, developed a larger brain, and this brain was then used to create social environments. So we became very mentally active. Now, when we became very intellectual, when we were displaced from the tropics or around the tropics and then eventually out of the tropics, we could use that mental ability to not just communicate with ourselves, study with ourselves, but also to investigate what our environment is, to understand it and see how we can manipulate to continue living. So our ability to think, which was a social ability, that enabled us also then to study nature in detail and create technologies to help us survive. That was our adaptation that was successful. All right, so we adapted to creating basically an artificial sense out of our thinking ability. To think is just, you can think anything. It's not a sense, not like eyesight, earsight, and so forth, which are automatic and always.
So that's not normal to any other species except us.
Right. Other species can analyze nature to agree, but it's very simple. Whereas humans developed in a way, as with other apes, an ability to think very in depth. Mm-hmm. And this allowed them to adapt to the changes that were put onto them by crustal displacement, mm-hmm. by manipulating their environment to create an environment that would, an artificial environment that could support them.
And we're the only ones, we're the only species that does that. So we are special, right. We are unique. I mean, a lot of religions will say, oh, humans aren't, you know, they're not like the rest of nature. They separate us from the rest of the animal, you know, world. And it's true to some extent, but not for the reasons that they think it is.
No, we're an animal. We're one of the species. We have the same DNA as everything. And we have unique abilities, just like every species has its own unique abilities. A bear or a dog, a wolf, they have incredible senses of smell, and we don't have that at all. Other animals such as eagles and birds, they have incredible eyesight. We have, relative to them, poor eyesight. Mm-hmm. Right? So they use their natural senses and abilities particular to them to adapt and survive an environment, and we use ours. So we don't have powerful senses like them, smell, eyesight, hearing, and so forth, but we used our ability to think, to socialize, and so forth, to create a mental ability to study nature and figure out how to live artificially by manipulating our environment to suit ourselves wherever we found ourselves. All right. Okay. When we're in the tropics, we don't have to do that. We didn't have to do that because it was always warm, food's everywhere. We instinctively learned which animals to stay away from and so forth by communication between each other, right?
And we obviously spent a long time there developing our physical, you know, our physiology.
Yeah, we evolved there for millions of years, slowly turning into the ape. And that we didn't evolve from the apes. We are part of them, right? We have cousins called the orangutan and gorilla, but we didn't evolve from them. We were alongside. We came from the common root millions of years back.
Okay.
So yeah, we evolved into what we were in the tropics. We were being shifted around. And by the time we developed, say, 3 million years ago into what we call the human, then at that point, we had developed our brain. And when we got knocked further around outside the tropics, we started using that to develop technologies that enabled us to live outside the tropics. This is called civilization.
Right, and civilization keeps us warm, keeps us fed, keeps us housed.
Right.
Even though nature's not providing that anymore. Like you and I live in the northern latitudes, we couldn't survive here. It's too cold and there's no food. So civilization allows us to live here and not adapt to this.
Right, we develop a way to live that enables us to live outside the tropics. We domesticate ourselves and say, okay, we no longer can depend on the wild, living wildly as all our instincts are telling us. We have to use our brain to think of ways to manipulate nature to create means by which we can continue living. And so we become dependent on our thinking ability, our science and technology for our lives. And that science and technology, and then communicating that knowledge, those three are the basis of civilization. Those are the cornerstones of it.
Okay.
Those three.
And that started like say 3 million years ago, we were moved out of the tropics sufficiently that we needed to develop civilization in order to continue existing.
And so it would have been slow at that point, and there were many different species, varieties of humans. There's only one left today. That's us, Homo sapiens sapiens. And many of the species, the variety of species of us, didn't make it. They lost their way. They weren't able to adapt. But one of them was able to, that came out of it all, and that's us. All right. So it's telling us that it's very difficult, very chancy to be able to get through these displacements. All right.
Okay, but humans managed for 3 million years,
yeah.
And they left evidence of their civilizations and how they lived, and they actually passed down this information about crustal displacement. And
right.
So at some point we need to talk about, I guess, why that information is not known now. Why has it become?
So we'd see when we look into the past of behavior of the human or its lifestyle, and going back, say, 100,000 years and 50,000 years and 20,000 years, similar. We see that it built much differently than today. We see it built stone constructions, very high technology. They built things that we could not even build today. They've built structures we don't even understand how they could possibly have made it out of stone. We have caves underground, pyramids and aqueducts and so on, just covering the planet. And they're in every country and in huge volumes. And we wonder what happened to these people, why they live that way. And anyways, further study of it, such as paleontology and archaeology, reveals many more details. And so a person can do that and note how different that is than we're living today. So the archaeological and paleontological and historical evidence is showing that humanity was living in accord with crustal displacement. It was creating a societal infrastructure that could withstand crustal displacement. That's why they had to build with huge, massive stones, basically creating mountains that could resist, mountains of stones for their buildings that could then resist dependably all these earthquakes that occurred during crustal displacement.
And just as a related sidebar there, they developed concretes or cements that we have no idea how they created them. And some of them are still in existence to today.
Yeah. The more recent research since about the 1980s with Joseph Davidovitz, he showed that the concrete structures, the pyramid structures, stone structures, are made out of artificially made reagglomerated stone, basically concrete, a very special form of concrete, high quality cements used to make artificial rock that looks identical to natural rock because it creates the same mineral structure that binds the rock together. You only can tell the difference if you look at it with chemically and using other sophisticated chemical techniques. If you just look at it, say with a magnifying glass, it looks the same. But chemically and other ways, it has much different properties than natural rock, such as has too many minerals of a certain type or a certain chemical structure, and on and on.
And that's a very smart thing to do, to develop those ways of creating artificial rocks. So you weren't dependent on the rocks existing in nature. You could make your own rocks, and you could make buildings out of this substance that could withstand anything, and had over the eons.
Very durable, very long lasting. The concretes that they've created, they're actually geopolymers, are very durable, resistant to weathering. They last thousands of years. Modern concrete that we make is just cheap cements, and it deteriorates quite quickly when exposed to weather. Maybe it'll erode away in 100 years or so. Whereas we have from past artificial rock structures such as the pyramids and the aqueducts and temples all over the so-called temples all over the earth that are thousands of years old, 5, 6, 10,000 years old and more. All right. And many of them look as if they are made just yesterday. They're in perfect shape. Many have lost, most have undergone great erosion because of earthquakes, being flooded and so forth. But there are some, like the pyramids in the interior parts, that are just shiny as glass and smooth.
Really?
And yeah, and it's difficult to imagine how they could have constructed it at all. We don't know how, right? So they had a technology and abilities that we don't have today.
Right. Previous cultures overall have been greatly shortchanged in the retail.
Yeah, they have been,
history.
Immensely, right? So we can see that our modern civilization is ruled and driven by an establishment of people who don't want us to see that, don't want us to realize that we have an ancestral past that is much more highly developed than what we're told.
Right.
We have a history that is being hidden from us,
right.
And that hiding is serving those who control civilization today.
Right. So the civilizations that existed before, they had this information about crustal displacement. They knew what they needed to do in order to survive it. They did survive it. And now we need to find out what we need to do to make sure that humanity survives into the future. But the main thing that another connection, I guess, is that these people passed the information down. They had, like you said, there were various pockets of civilization around, sustainable civilization around the earth, but they all had the information, right? And they all passed it down to their progeny, to their children, and it was lived. They knew it, they understood it, they knew when it was coming, they knew when they were living in a peaceful phase, and they knew that they couldn't get too casual about the earth, because the earth, geology rules them. So, yeah. I guess I want to get to why this information got so lost and corrupted, and how it can be forgotten.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we saw humanity evolved through these crustal displacement and created a way, a living civilization to be able to adapt to it and continue thriving in it. They created a cultural way to live, and not they did that constantly. They lived what the crustal events were doing. They lived that knowledge. They turned all their knowledge about how the earth is behaving into cultural activity. It was
like for example, what's cultural activity? Like plays, theater, that kind of thing? Is that what you mean?
Yeah, exactly. They did it in any entertainment they had. They did it in the layout of their cities. They copied it into their behavior in their, say, family, in society in general, in the shapes of their cities, in their knowledge, how they recorded it. And so for a prime example is mythology. Okay. They created mythology as a means by which to incorporate this knowledge of how the earth behaved in their society itself, culturally. And by living it culturally, they couldn't forget it, because you're taught it from birth, and you just keep repeating it over and over, just as we do today, keep reliving over and over what we're taught from a kid. Automatically repeat it.
And what is the definition of mythology? When we talk about a myth now, we generally say, we use myth synonymously with falsehood. If you want to say something's false, you say it's a myth. But that's not the true definition of myth or mythology.
No, that's just a secondary definition. the prime definition, the definition is the recording of knowledge in story form.
Okay.
Using human characters and animal characters to represent the knowledge, which will be nature knowledge, how the earth behaves and the universe behaves in general.
So
that's mythology.
They pass these stories, these mythological stories, along down through the generations, and they personified various aspects of nature and gave them names. And those stories have now been taken literally. We'll get into that a little later. But let's talk a little bit about the nature of those stories, you know, the specific stories themselves.
Well, to storify knowledge is a natural way for the human to remember things. We remember stories, remember anything that has to do with human characters. We automatically remember that forever. For example, you watch a movie when you're 5 years old, you remember it still today. But when you were taught something in school at 5 years old, you don't know what that is. You can't remember what the textbook said. All right, that's gone. So when things are storified, the brain naturally remembers that because we're human. When we hear human stories, we remember them. So our ancestors took advantage of that and turned their knowledge into story form, which then would be recorded, would be remembered forever. All right. The people just had to remember that the stories that they're passing down are describing nature and not the actual individuals that are portrayed or made up in the mythology that are representing nature. All right.
What are some examples of these personifications that people have interpreted as being real people that never existed? They were just stories.
Yeah. So mythology is, again, evidence, connecting evidence to show that how humans knew how Earth behaved. They were aware of crustal displacement and all the different motions of 4 different motions of Earth, and then of nature in general, and humanity and civilization. So an example of mythology is the term Jesus Christ or Jesus, and Egypt and Israel and Abraham and so forth. Now, the term Jesus means the early morning rising sun, the sun at around 6 a.m. to say 9 or 10 a.m. when it's low in the sky, and at which point its reflection can still be seen shining on water. And then the sun is said to be walking on water. And when you personify it into Jesus, you say, Jesus is walking on water. The early morning sun is walking on water. It's a reflection of the sun. Now, as the sun rises higher in the sky, you can no longer see the reflection of the sun because it is at your feet. You'd have to be standing on the water in order to be able to see it. Right. And so in that case, you'd be in the water, right? So the midday sun cannot be seen reflecting on the water. And the name that our ancient ancestors gave for the midday sun was Christ, the anointed one, the one who gives the sermon at noon. It's at the height of the sky. So that's Christ. And then we have the afternoon sun, which is Moses. And then we have the evening sun, which is Set or Seth, sunset. And then we have the night times, which is dark past midnight, and we don't have a sun. It's given various names like Satan, I guess, underworld, and Lucifer in the morning. Lucifer meaning the it's the same as dawn. Lucifer, the unripe sun, which Lucy means what is it? Fur means flame, and Lucy means not quite seen or unripe or something like that. Anyways, that term means the light seen in the morning without seeing the sun yet. The sun hasn't quite risen. but the light is there. That's Lucifer.
So those various names were given to phases of the sun, and stories were made up about behavior
so
of the sun.
Right. And so these names, Jesus and Christ and Lucifer and so forth, were then combined into a play, made into stories, how they interacted with each other. And if you're not aware that it's describing nature, you will take it literally and think they're actually talking about people. Right. That's what we do today.
That's what religion does.
Right. And so in the past, our ancestors did this with everything. So they looked at the night sky and they named every constellation and star a name, and made stories up between those names, dramatic, human-like stories, all right?
Right.
To show the interaction between different stars, their relationship to each other, how the Earth rotated, and so forth. And so we have thousands or tens of thousands of mythology stories from different cultures around the Earth, all describing the same thing.
And the constellations and the night sky, the stars are very important. Were very important to our ancient ancestors because they could learn a lot about the behavior of the Earth from looking at the stars, because they're kind of like signposts. You can tell when you've moved on Earth based on your perspective to the star, right?
Yeah, they studied the stars in detail so they could, from that, determine that the Earth was wobbling, that it was going around the sun, and that it had a tilt, an effective tilt because of the wobble, and it rotated daily, of course. And in the story from this could get recorded over, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of years. They're always knowing about it, and the knowledge that is in it, they're living culturally. So within their own behavior, they're remembering how the Earth is behaving, and that's set, and it doesn't change, and they hold rigidly to it because this is how they evolved, and it's what allowed them to continue living on Earth. Gave them a stability. All right. So their life was dependent on that culture that they came to live. And if they changed it, that meant they would fall out of behaving in accord with how Earth was working and how nature worked. Right. And by that, they would lose their lives.
And that's what's happened to us.
Right. And so Crustal Displacement comes along, and if you're not living by it culturally and physically, structurally, when one comes along, you're toast because you're not prepared for it. You're not building for it. You don't know how to behave anymore, and you're being shifted to a new environment.
So what we have here is an entirely new human history timeline. This is a completely different development of humanity that besides what we've been taught, it's completely different. And the only part that's relevant is maybe the last 6,000 years or so, where we've had recorded civilization, and where humanity started to diverge from those stable, long-living cultures and move away from this knowledge that had allowed humanity to survive so long on Earth. So, how did that happen? Do you want to get into that yet? Do you have more to say?
Yeah, we can go into that. We have today history going back to 6,000 years, and they always tend to stop there, acting as if civilization has only developed since then, began then and developed since then, and turned into what we have today. And we're acting as if this is the ultimate supreme development of the human species, of humanity.
Right.
There's nothing before that. And so we see that there's a mainstream, there's a mainstream group that's pushing that. The 6,000 years is telling us there was a start, something happened.
There's a shift.
If we look at previous ancient civilization, we see it creating all these structures and having a way of living that went on far back in time that's much different than us now, much more stable. So to discover what happened, we just look to crust displacement. We investigate the events that happened. And what it is that we had a crust displacement that occurred 20,000 years ago, at which time there was maximal ice on the surface of Earth. continental ice, and this is mostly located on North America. There was a huge ice cap covering about 2/3 of North America, and
Mm-hmm.
almost the same as in Antarctica as is now.
Mm-hmm.
And that meant maximal ice on continental land, which meant a minimal ocean level, 430 feet lower than we had now. So the crustal displacement occurred and brought that North America, which was at the geographical North Pole at that time, 20,000 years ago, and it moved it 1,800 miles out, or about 30 degrees out, to where it is now. And that ice cap that is North America totally melted over the ensuing 13,000 years.
Which
And
brought sea levels way up.
Raised sea levels, which the geologic evidence shows it rose at 430 feet to what we have today. All right, it's maximum level. Now it's going to drop because of the next crustal displacement coming up. Now, that event, that crustal displacement took, say, 2,000 years, 3,000 years to occur and then stop. But due to the changes in form of the crust, it rises in some places and lowers in others. You get after effects such as earthquakes and some volcanism in different areas. So you get occasional outbursts of geological activity in the thousands of years afterwards. Nothing like during the crustal displacement itself, but periodically here and there as the crust just seeks little rebalances here and there in parts of it.
So what happened? What happened 6,000 years ago? Oh, I'm sorry. So now, I'm not sure if you were finished there.
Okay, so we have that occurring, but the biggest thing was that the ocean levels rose due to the ice cap on North America melting completely, 100%. When you do the volumes of that ice cap, we know it was about 3,000 miles across and 2 miles deep and so forth. We know that volume of ice there is about 3% of the volume of the ocean, which would raise the ocean level by 430 feet, which it has. So that level, the ocean stopped rising about 7,000 years ago. While it was rising, humanity couldn't stabilize as a civilization worldwide on the planet. It had, prior to the displacement, developed a worldwide civilization that had all kinds of knowledge and building abilities and so forth. It made it through the crust displacement and then started trying to rebuild in its little pockets. But it couldn't because the ocean level was constantly rising. Most of humanity today, as in the past, lives on the coast, 70%, 80%. But the coast was always being flooded by the rising water. And so you couldn't, there's no stability. You couldn't, say, build a town or something at the shoreline and expect it to stay there for 100 years because the ocean was rising. You had to always move back and back inland and ultimately miles inland, right? But about 7,000 years ago, the ocean level stopped rising dramatically. It had, prior to that, because of the melting ice cap, been rising dramatically, but around 7,000 years ago, that dropped off to almost flat. In the last 7,000 years, the ocean level has only risen about 10 feet. In the last 2,000 years, maybe a foot. In the last 1,000 years, just inches. And today, it's only rising maybe a millimeter each year. So it's just dropped right off to nothing. And we're at the point where crustal displacement is going to happen, and that's going to cause ice to start building on North America and Greenland and Europe, which is going to start dropping ocean levels dramatically over the next couple thousand or 4,000, 5,000 years. All right, so the ocean level is going to drop. But of course, it's over thousands of years. Anyways, in slowing down, rising the ocean enabled that humanity start building up again stably. It didn't have to worry about moving cities and being flooded out by rising waters. And that is the beginning of modern civilization. What happened was the civilization that covered the world had been broken up into pockets, and these
became separated from each other, and they had to redevelop to reconnect and so forth. And it was the case that in the Mediterranean there was a group of people there that became very isolated and were keeping to themselves. And as they redeveloped, they were a seafaring fisherman type people, which archaeological evidence shows that from 12,000 years ago. But around 6,000 years ago, they suddenly started developing into a much richer city-style population, and they were accomplishing this through trading or by sea with other societies in the Mediterranean. And from that, they just kept expanding throughout the world, trading and creating richness for themselves by that. And these people, this group of people, which were a splinter group now of humanity, they kept themselves, they were inbreeding and developing wealth for themselves through trading. And they were located in the Levant of the Eastern Mediterranean, all right? And by studying linguistics, the history of language, and the expansion of cultures, it can be determined that humanity today, the modern civilization, is living their way of life, with them running the show through trade. They started it, all right?
So it wasn't enough that they created this way to sustain themselves with trading. They actually conquered other peoples. They went in and sort of took control of the other cultures.
Right. So by being the middleman, they're trading. They're not producing the actual goods. They're just trading. They're profiting off of that trade. They're gaining great amount of wealth by just exchanging goods between different societies in that area. All right. And then by keeping to themselves as a group, they're not racially mixing with others or humanly mixing. They're keeping themselves, but they're also infiltrating these cultures that they're trading with and gaining positions in or powerful positions in those societies because of the wealth that they're creating for themselves. All right.
And so they had apparently lost the information that all other sustained human cultures had about the geology of the earth. They didn't know that information, but the cultures that they were conquering did, and they sort of stole that information and repurposed it for their purposes.
Well, no, sort of. All the societies that existed, whether they're lost or had become self-idolizing, you'd say, focus only on themselves, they had the information about the mythological information recorded, each in their own language or societal development. But this particular group started taking their mythology literally and posing it as describing themselves. These characters that were in their mythology, they pose as themselves.
Okay. And within the mythology, there are leaders, there are regular people, and they pose themselves as the leaders.
That's right. And the mythology that we're talking about is basically the description of the celestial sky. To understand the motions of the earth, its four motions, you merely have to study the motion of the stars. By studying that in depth, you see that, the earth is rotating daily, and that it's going around the sun, that it's wobbling, and that it has periodic crustal displacements that bring devastation and an apparent change of how the stars rotate around Earth. And so
when that happens, you get a new pole star. I mean, I know you're always talking about pole stars.
Right. And so when we study the celestial sky, we see that there's one star up there called the North Star and the South Pole Star that don't move. Earth is spinning and our axis points at that star.
Right.
And so it looks, from our perspective, we don't see that star moving, but we see all other stars revolving around it.
Right.
And then we see a band of stars called the zodiac behind, in front of which the sun is moving throughout the year. In 1 year, the sun goes through each of those constellations, and it does that year after year forever. And so those are special constellations, and they divide the sky into two. So you have the upper half, lower half, right?
Mm-hmm.
You also have the Milky Way going through there and all kinds of other constellations. Those are all put into story form.
Mm-hmm.
And the pole stars are a family of stars that repeat because the Earth is wobbling. Its axis is moving on a 26,000 year period through a circle that points at successively different pole stars or north stars,
Mm-hmm.
the north and south star in the south.
Mm-hmm.
And that's called in story form, that's the pole star family or the royal family, the monarchy. All right. And so this has all been turned into mythology stories, and the pole star becomes the ruler of the entire sky. Right. And then it has houses in it also that these are called these are the zodiac constellation, the houses, the tribes, all right? And so
this is where the idea of humans being ruled by
right.
royalty, or that some people are born into positions of power, that's right. where this came from, because they're misinterpreting mythology and
that's right.
posing themselves as leaders.
Right. So they're creating a false representation of humanity, how it should live, based on misinterpreting what a description of the sky was in story form, which is called mythology. Right. So this group that was in the Mediterranean that was trading took their mythology literally as describing themselves, and so they posed themselves as the rulers of the sky. And the sky, of course, is the celestial sky, and that's the universe. Mm-hmm. When you look at the sky, you see the universe. And so the pole star becomes the ruler, the leader of the universe, which is following it. And these people pose themselves as that. They took their own mythology literally. And of course, other cultures had that mythology as well, but they weren't posing it themselves. And
they knew what it meant.
They knew what it meant. But the culture, this Eastern Mediterranean culture, as they infiltrated, they started falsely interpreting the other people's, other societies' mythology and representing it as describing themselves too. All right. And so it got all literalized. Everyone's mythology got slowly literalized and then written into story form. And then some of those stories collected into a book, which today we know as the Bible, mm-hmm. the Holy Bible, right?
Mm-hmm.
And
so the Bible is actually mythology based on observations of the stars and the religious interpretation of the Bible is the underlying foundation of religion.
Yeah, religion takes it literally. Those are mythology stories of all different types of cultures that in the Mediterranean and other parts of the world that the Levant, Eastern Mediterranean people collected and rewrote a little bit and put into that book. And they're describing the stars. All those stories are describing the behavior of the stars and the earth and nature. Mm-hmm. And when taken literally, as this group was doing, that creates religion, where you think what you're reading is describing people or yourself or the earth, or the animals and so forth, where in reality it's describing the stars' behavior.
Right.
And again, when you study the star behavior, you understand the earth behavior, and that includes crustal displacement. Mm-hmm. So you're losing out on all the actual scientific information isn't there and turning into a nonsensical story by pretending those characters are actual humans that do these behaviors that humans cannot do, such as walking on water or ruling over the universe or so on, all these different stories.
And let's talk about a specific example of a story that's been so literalized, like Noah and the ark.
Yeah, we could talk about the Exodus, or we talk about Noah. Now, Noah is a description of day turning to night, as so many stories in the Bible are. It's a lot of repeats because different stories from different cultures are saying the same thing. They're given different names, but you include them in the same book. So we get lots of descriptions, repeated descriptions of day turning to night. And that's the Noah story, that's the Great Flood. So basically, you have that story describing how the earth is floating in space, in the waters of space, and underneath it are the dark waters, and above is the sun shining, so it's light, and you have the arc of the sky above the earth, right?
Arc, yeah.
The arc of the sky. And at nighttime, the waters from below, the darkness, floods over the earth. That's the flood, turning the arc of the daytime sky
There's
dark.
no water. It's just
no water.
darkness.
No, it's just darkness. It's the waters that the earth is floating in.
That's
the waters,
personification.
right. The waters are an old term to describe the universe that the earth is floating in. Those are the waters. All the stars and objects we see out there, okay? And of course, the waters below us are dark because the sun's not shining there, all right? And so every night, those waters were described as flooding over the daytime sky, the arc of the daytime sky. And now when night comes about, we start to see the stars and there's constellations. And those all have been named animals and human figures such as Taurus and Aries and Capricorn, the goat, and so on. And we have human figures such as Virgo and Cepheus and
Leo, Sagittarius, Capricorn.
yeah, there's Gemini, which are the twins. We have other constellations outside the zodiac, such as, well, the Virgo's one of them, but who's the Virgin, a female. We have, who else? We have Hercules and Heracles, which is a constellation in the sky, of course, you know, Hercules, and tons of others.
So none of those are people. They're all stars.
Not people, they're constellations. So now as the nighttime sky appears, we see these constellations with names appearing. They're animal and human constellations. And so they're boarding the arc of the sky. We get the nighttime sky and loaded in the arc of that sky, loaded with its animals, domesticated animals like the goat and the cattle or the bull and sheep, along with wild animals like rabbits and snakes and so forth. They're boarding the ark of the night sky. All right, that's Noah's Ark. The term Noah means sky. That's all it means, whether it's the day sky or the night sky. So Noah's Ark is the dome of the sky over earth, whether it's night or day. And when night comes about, it floods over. You get Noah's flood, and the animals board the nighttime ark. All right. And then stay on there. And then when the morning comes, they disembark to then populate Earth's surface, which you now can see. So you get all the humans walking around and the animals walking around on Earth's surface. All right. So there we have the flood. The flood of darkness comes over. The animals board the arc of the sky because they're all given names as constellations and so forth. And then when the flood recedes, they reappear on Earth and spread all over the Earth again to populate it. All right. And this is animal figures and human figures. We see in the morning of the flood, after the flood's over, we see the dove being sent out. And that's just expressing how birds make, noises in the morning. They sing, they tweet, coos, coo in the morning. Doves coo in the morning. That's when you hear them. The early bird gets the worm. And so Noah, he sends out a crow, which is black, and it doesn't come back, I don't think. And that's indicating it's not light yet. But then he sends out a dove and again, and finally the dove doesn't come back. And that's a story from statement that it is now morning. The light is there.
Right.
Dove has awakened.
And the point is, all the information behind that story has been lost in favor of people thinking that Noah was this person who had a boat and there was a flood of water. And it's the same with all of the biblical stories, like Sodom and Gomorrah and Samson and Delilah, and all of those stories are not people. Were never people. They were always stars.
They're always stars. They're always aspects of nature.
Very important information behind each one of those stories. It's stories that's been lost completely.
Yeah, it's been lost because they've been taken literally as people, and then you get these really strange stories as if it's a human character, and it doesn't make sense. It sounds like a child nursery rhyme. Yes. And so that's been taken seriously and turned a modular engine, and now we have adults believing these very childish stories, and instead of acting clear-minded and realizing the information that it's expressing. So we live today in religion totally disconnected from Earth and the universe, how it behaves.
Right.
We just live in a paradigm of childish stories where people then think, oh, I can live forever, and once I die, I go somewhere and it still exists, and nonsense like that. Instead of living grounded on Earth and saying, no, you're living here like any other organism, and you need to behave correctly so that you can continue living in your little niche here. You got to live a certain way, and if you stop doing that, you go extinct.
And so it's easy to understand over the last 6,000 years how this one culture could expand so much and become so rich and so powerful that they could then, with this great forgetting of previous knowledge, direct us off on this tangent that we're on now, that's so crazy and so fragile, like you've said before, and shaky and unsustainable.
Right. This started about 6,000 years ago when they started building up into their little cities and then big cities, gaining richness. And so it created an elite level within that society who owned these companies and these trading programs and gain great richness. And so you get two tiers in that society. You have a rich layer and then just the common layer, right? And the rich layer owns and controls everything, and everyone else just goes along. Now, these original people on the Levant of the Mediterranean were called Phoenicians, right? They're through archaeological evidence, we see that they were very high level trading, building cities, intercompeting heavily with each other very intensely, trying to gain richness one city over the other in that area, and that they were inbreeding, that which is termed highly independent, or and that they were seafaring, trading, and expanded worldwide, that they were warmongering, and they would spread lies. Of course, the lie that their mythology and all people's mythology was describing people and animals instead of the universe. Yeah. That's the original lie. That's the foundation of modern civilization. Believe in that lie, the religion.
And also
that was used as a means to subjugate all of humanity to the Phoenicians, who were posing themselves as the pole star ruler and the zodiacal constellation ruler of the sky, which they portrayed as the rest of humanity.
And eventually humanity came to accept that story.
Yeah, right. That's right. You spread that story enough, just like we do today. You hear the lie enough right. Minds are conquered over generations, slowly over generations, starting with the young, and that becomes accepted because that's all that you're hearing. And the powerful people, the ones that own the business and control communication, just keep putting that story out, and no other story gets out. All right. And if it does, it's only amongst a small group of the people.
Right.
Just a very small portion, but that doesn't matter because you have the bulk that are being fed the lies and believing that. So overall, you're basically breaking up they broke up humanity, world humanity, into little arguing, dumbed down, confused parts. And by that, they could control it by saying, we know the story, we're the experts, we tell you how it is, and we own and control everything, so you have no other choice.
And another thing that separates this culture from all the others that had existed up until that point is they became centered around profit, around usury, and money.
Yeah.
And that was very central to their culture, and greed and things that had really never been known in human culture before. I mean, money was probably used, I don't know, but it wasn't. We know now that everything is about money. People are stymied to explain, why is everything about money? Why is money so important? And it's because of this, brainwashing, of course.
Yeah. And we haven't been properly educated about what is money and so many other things. Now, money is work, all right? Mm-hmm. Money is something absolutely valuable, that has value, intrinsic value to it, and is tradable. So, for example, I would go out and grow a tree with some oranges, and a neighbor, he grows apples, and we put our work into it. And our work, that orange represents our work, because if we hadn't done it, there'd be no oranges. And so I want apples and he wants oranges. So we trade our work with each other. We're trading work for work. Mm-hmm. The work, that orange, is called money.
Right.
All right. And so when we exchange the money, there's no profit there. We're changing equal work for equal work. We're valuing the work equally. I'll give you 5 apples, you give me 5 oranges, all right? There's no profit occurring, only exchange of your own work, which you own your own work, all right? That is yours, and you're willing to trade it with someone else, and it facilitates getting more, like development. That person's good at that, I'm good at this, so we'll trade our work, all right? So that's how our ancients developed. But with this group that came along, these Phoenicians, they were just into trading for the sake of skimming money off of the work. So they exchange goods between people, and they're acting as a middleman, and say, for the exchange, I'm taking a percentage of what you guys made, of your work. Mm-hmm. And by trading, they were able to take this 5 whatever percent from everybody. And so they're gaining extremely great wealth for not doing anything, not producing anything.
That's what I was going to say, although they didn't participate in the work themselves. They just skim the profit.
They're just trading it. So they're the middleman that stands between the producers, and they're skimming money. They're taking actual worth. Like they're saying, I'll trade your apples and oranges, but I'm keeping 10% to myself. All right?
Right. And that was new. That's unique to them.
Right. That's unique to them. They valued that profit. They wanted that easy money, right? That's what was enabling them to get their power and control, and then self-fame, thinking they're something, special above everyone else, that they rule over them. So that's their mentality. They want to be leaders of everything and create richness for themselves, just like the pole star family of stars that control everything and rule the universe, apparently from Earth's perspective, okay? Now, so that's the basis for the new civilization called modern civilization, as opposed to ancient civilization, which used all production to serve all of humanity equally. Mm-hmm. Knowledge was given equally everywhere, no one trying to get above the other, profiting or skimming off the work of another. Modern civilization is skimming money, trying to skim money off of someone else so that you don't have to work yourself. All right, that's the rich people, the corporations, government, banks, and so forth, which are now run by these Phoenicians. Now, what that is doing is using our science, studying our nature, and technology, implementing or creating systems or objects or machinery to help us live, ways of living, to create profit. Science and technology are a money-making system, right? We create goods and so forth that are worth, that we want, that allow us to live. But in the past, that was used to serve all of humanity equally. So we could live outside the tropics around the world. And that was developed naturally through evolution. But with the rise of the Phoenicians, they used the science and technology to create profit for themselves, to create a profit-making new civilization that then depended on the profit for the economy of the world to keep it going, right? So you get the rich people, and they need this percentage to keep themselves rich, and then over time they made the money, the goods, the work of the people represented as dollar bills or coins and so forth. And so that gave them a means by which to control how people spent their money, how they exchanged it, and what they could, how they could exchange it. So, for example, you know, if you take, say, someone's work, a server, say, mowing a lawn, or someone building a house, and represent that in paper form, you can much more easily skim the paper than you can the house. It gives you a means by which to control money. So when you go to trade money with some person, you don't have to trade, say, a house for a car, which is tough to pack around. You only have to change dollar bills.
The representation.
The representation. And then the representation can be skimmed easily. That's called usury and profit making. The corporations do. They don't skim, say, some oranges from a person that the person grew. They only have to skim the dollar bills now from that person. They can tax them, all right? Charge them a rate of a percentage for you know, using some area of land they own or something like that.
Here, move your mic up a little bit.
Yeah, can you hear me all still?
Yeah, that's good. That's good.
Okay. Yeah. All right, my phone's going off. I'll leave it.
Sorry.
So that's been the slow development of currency to represent money. Now, money is actual goods and services again. It's not the dollar bill. It's not the 1 or 0 on the computer. Right? That's the artificial fiat, fake representative money.
Robert, move your mic up. Can't hear you.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Very tough.
Okay.
Were you able to hear any of that?
Just like the last sentence was pretty faint.
Right. So money is actual goods, services. Currency isn't. It's fiat money. It's the declared money, the legalized money that represents the actual money. And by making that legalized money, you can skim that value of the good infinitely easier. You don't have to take the actual good and pack it around and try and hoard it. You just hoard dollar bills or ones and zeros on your computer. So that way you can create very easy, high wealth. You can store it and then use that to control everything, the world economy. So we've developed a world economy that uses our science and technology to create easy money or profit for the elite that come to own the businesses and the land through their richness that they gained. All right. And the richness allows them to gain societal positions above others. And now
they've had 6,000 years to do this.
Yeah, they've done this increasingly.
That's a long period.
Right. And they've done this increasingly in more complex ways, competing with each other over these 6,000 years until we have today. It's basically a rape and pillage system. It's stealing from humanity's work to create richness for a very select few and impoverishment for others, because their wealth, their work is being always taken away. So they're forced to always work more and more and more and more. And then
the reason why we never hear history recounted in this way is because they control all the information. They control the media, they control the publishing houses, they have for a very long time.
thousands of
whatever
years.
they want us to believe about our history, they will have printed in the textbooks. They'll have printed in the magazines, media. All forms of information are controlled by these progeny of the original Phoenicians, right?
Right. So they came to take over all institutions, all powerful organizational systems of society. Their communication systems, their science systems, arts, which is part of communication, and technology. They own them basically now. They increasingly started from 6,000 years ago. Now that family of Phoenicians own everything, and they are inbreeding, and they keep their wealth to themselves. They're the elite of the Phoenicians. They don't give it away, because to give it away means to reduce their power, their control, and their wealth. It stays in the family, right? They inbreed.
Right.
And so now they control all communications, all publishing, all media, entertainment. And so we only hear what they want us to hear.
Right.
If it doesn't agree with what they want us to hear, the corporate head or the editor doesn't publish it. He doesn't allow it.
Right.
And so the information that common humanity are fed is extremely biased. It is one-sided, completely one-sided.
And sometimes completely fanciful.
And totally made up, such as mythology turned to religion. We're pumped all this false information about religion, that there's such a person as Jesus, or there's such an individual as a God looking down upon us. We're not taught what these terms actually mean. We're just told lies. Now, this culture of Phoenicians, they're based on a lie, their false mythology. And to cover that, they have to endlessly make more lies. Right? You don't tell the truth, you got to cover it with a lie.
Everybody knows that. If you tell a lie, you got to have a good memory, because then you have to remember your lie and tell more lies on top of it.
Yeah, the truth, you're just expressing what was, so you don't have to remember anything.
Right.
With a lie, you got to remember and then make more lies to cover it, and it just becomes endlessly super complicated and convoluted and all mixed up. And so this group, by maintaining themselves, they always have to spread lies and more lies. And to develop their economy, their profiting system, to make more profit, they set up false scenarios to create profiteering situations for themselves, such as wars. They create turmoil between, say, two different societies. So those societies start battling, and by that, using more goods. And the traders then can profit off of that good exchange.
Right. And this is so easily done, because if you own the information stream, you feed a narrative to one side, and that the other side is the enemy, and you feed the opposite narrative to the other side, and they're warring with each other, and they 100% believe that they're defending their countries.
That's right. So the people are fooled.
They're just chess pieces, basically.
That's all they are. They're servants. They're cows and bees. These are the land of milk and honey here, and we're the cattle on the farm. Modern humanity, consuming and working to provide the means for profit, the skimming of money for the elite that run and control the businesses.
Right.
And so we have developed civilization into modern civilization, a corporate business for profit, and run by racketeering, creating false stories, manufactured events to keep people believing that they got to go to war, or they got to fight for this, fight that, to create more consumerism. All right. It's a profit-based system. And we've now been living it so long and only hearing about it that we think it's normal and good. We think profit is good. But profit is not. Profit is skimming off the back of another's work so you don't have to work yourself.
Right.
And that is the opposite to nature. Right? There's no other species that do this, proving that if you do, you go extinct. Nature doesn't support it. But modern humanity does, and it tries to get away with that because the rich are controlling everything. They want everything to stay that way because they're rich, but at the cost of humanity. And so we've created a modern civilization structure that's defeating ourselves. It is actually driving us into extinction. Modern civilization is the extinction process of the human species.
Right.
because it has been turned into a rape and pillage everything around you, including yourself, to prosper yourself, right?
And in doing that, the future of humanity has been lost. It's been thrown under
Right.
the bus.
In losing our correct understanding of what mythology is and knowledge behind it, within which is preserved crust displacement knowledge and how to live properly, we have separated ourselves from how to live as humanity on Earth, which was a way of life that was sustainable and guaranteed our long-term existence. We've removed that. We've thrown that information out and lost it completely and replaced it with nonsense.
Yeah.
And then developed an economy based on raping and pillaging Earth and humans to survive. It's like we're eating ourselves to survive,
Right.
to try and survive, right?
Right.
But you can't do that without killing yourself. And so we see that craziness in our world population today, in civilization, where it's polluting everything in sight. We got rich and poor, we got wars, we got nonsensical ideas like medicine going around promoting that evil spirits invade a person instead of them really being what they're eating, the false foods they're eating, and other dietary practices that overburden their bodies and cause it to break down, which is then called disease, and so forth. So we're modern civilization is very erratic and fractious, self-destroying, full of tumult. There's no calmness to it, no serenity, no stability. It's always changing, always unpredictable, very destructive, unlike any other species we see on the planet, and there's millions of them.
And it's this relative calm that we're living in, what you've called life cradling calmness between the displacements, that has allowed this extremely fragile civilization of ours to develop that would never have developed before. You can't have glass skyscrapers with people living in them, and sustain yourself through a crustal displacement. It's not going to happen. We have to do things the way that humanity learned that it had to do over hundreds of thousands of years.
Right. We developed a way of life that could live through crust displacements. The